the smartest guy with a bow tie in Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Tulis.
David Tulis, a large business called Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization, is giving $250,000 to the Chattanooga Area Food Bank as part of the Food Security Equity Impact Fund. And most of that money, 80%, according to an interview I had with one of the officials at the food bank, will be going to the Bethlehem Center, serving the rundown and poorer sections of Chattanooga. And to explain what the real story is here, we do have the story as reported in Chattanooga.com, but to find out what the real story might mean, I've got with me Allison McDowell. She is the editor and publisher of wrenchinthegears.com. That's wrenchinthegears.com. And I hope you sense that she's a disturbing force, you might say, a disturbing report on the new economy, the new world order, the Great Reset, that the good people with figureheads, these are just figureheads, such as Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates, managing the future and hoping to transform the world right down to your street. That's what they're proposing to do with a kind of religious mission, a missional fervor, to create what we have here in Chattanooga, one of Schwab's WEF G20 cities. We have a smart city. And we have in creation right now a municipal industrial complex with its numerous billionaire philanthropic interests behind the scenes. So, Allison, you publish at wrenchinthegears.com, and what has struck me about your work is your breathtaking simplicity of explaining what impact investing is and other things that are part of that story. So what, in your estimation, hearing these basic facts, what in your estimation is happening here in Howland County and Chattanooga with this donation from an impact investment fund, this Food Security Equity Impact Fund, with all the right keywords in it, Allison?
Right. Well, so impact investing, essentially it is this blending of government interests, investor interests, and then the nonprofit interests that deliver social services. So it is sort of privatizing, outsourcing public support services, whether that be helping for people who are food insecure, housing insecure, who have mental illness, addiction. It goes into the public education space. And then it's a way for outside investors, but these aren't just individual people, right? These are giant, massive portfolios. And when I initially started out looking in the education space, which I'm in Philadelphia, and I was looking at the privatization of the schools and how the money was flowing, it was flowing into hedge funds. Now, hedge funds, I mean, yes, there's people that work at hedge funds, but ultimately it's a machine that's these algorithms that are making bets. And so what has happened is through, essentially, we're moving into an economy where they've talked about undercutting people's ability to have a sustainable, stable career. It's a gig work, unstable. You have to have multiple gigs. They're talking about robots taking over work. Many people will not be able to necessarily have agency in the trajectory, to keep themselves stable, to keep their family stable. They may want to work, but they can't work because ultimately we're going to be competing through telepresence work with people all around the world with no protection. And that's the world that's being made today. And a huge part of that is that there will be many people who need to rely on some form of assistance. And that's going to be this universal basic income, UBI, some sort of, or jobs guarantee, or like a baseline. But it's not going to be a really satisfying life, right? It will sort of keep you alive and keep you jumping the hoops, but it's not that much. But it's a way for investors to invest in the services that will be provided, and in order for these services to advance in the deals, the way they're structured, and this is called pay for success finance, social impact bonds, outcomes-based government contracts. And they're actually very attractive on a bipartisan standpoint. And I come as someone who lives in in Philadelphia, so it's more, Democratic liberal city. But they get the liberals and the progressives and the conservative libertarians because they say, oh, well, we'll take care of people. Look, we're providing services. But on the conservative side, they say, oh, but we're getting data, so we know if it works. Right, so we're only paying for the good stuff. But what people aren't realizing is that these deals, which will run on data, essentially mean that the people who are pulled into the services, and that could be everything from, a kid in preschool to a veteran needing like PTSD, therapy, to a single mom who doesn't have enough food. All of those people then become, because of what we've built out in these smart cities with digital identity, with individual devices, essentially this spatial computing, ubiquitous computing. It is the panopticon. And it is a panopticon that is the pulse of which the hedge fund computers have the pulse of this machine, that we're swimming through data and signals and frequency in a panopticon. And most people just go throughout their whole day and they don't even quite realize it, although sometimes things will happen with the device or something will go wrong and they'll realize that they actually are in what I kind of frame like an open-air prison, like just waiting for you to have a misstep and then things fall. So these outcomes-based contracts that are tied to pay for success that essentially enmesh the government, private interests like money, from giant portfolio funds, from the teachers' pension funds, the government pension funds, your insurance premiums, everything. Like, you might think you're out of it, but like if you have a pension or you pay an insurance premium or you have a college savings bond with the state for your kid, you're in this thing because all these portfolios are essentially going to start betting on the life outcomes of disenfranchised people. And what's so crazy about this is once you reflect on what happened with the 2007-8 global economic crash around real estate, was the people who made out the best were the people who shorted, like who knew that things were going to go wrong, and they bet that they were going to go wrong. And it's because these debt securities, the debt to provide the services, will be securitized and then traded as liquid debt assets, just like the mortgage securities were. So, like, literally, you might have a debt product that has, like, thousands of pre-K children in Head Start, and someone's betting on their futures. So, in these pay-for-success finance things, the premise is that there's some future. Essentially, what it does, it's interesting. It's like everyone is predictively profiled based on their digital footprint. And even unborn children will be based on their parents' digital footprint of how likely they are to be a burden on society and how much that burden is going to cost to the government. And that's needed to run the deals, right? And that's not really the government is providing the access for private capital into the people. So the government role is really central, but it's not driven by the government. It's driven by the BlackRock, the Blackstone, the Impact Management Project. And so we've essentially created a society that everyone is presumed deficient. It's just, how deficient are you? Are you going to be addicted? Are you going to be in jail? Are you going to be underemployed? Are you going to be depressed? Are you going to be homeless? And all of those has a cost assigned. And the way these work is they come and preemptively fix you, even if you haven't had anything bad happen to you yet.
Well, let's go back, Allison McDowell, let's go back to the investor fund that has real people sitting at desks and computer terminals at a large, let's say a large hedge fund with private capital, existing capital in it, or some of it perhaps borrowed into existence, and they're saying, we want to bet on Chattanooga. So someone has made a bet about Chattanooga, and they're not betting in the negative. They're saying we can make a profit through our impact fund, giving money to the food bank in here in Chattanooga. That money will make us a profit. How can these investors get a positive return in Chattanooga from this money? Because they don't want to lose money, right? They don't want to have a loss.
Exactly.
Right. So where do they get their gain? Their net,
so the accountants and the lawyers are also major players in this, and in the global space, like KPMG and Deloitte and Accenture and the big, because they set the terms of the game. Like, these deals are a game, really. Like, it's a game and a story. And none of it, like, it's somewhat grounded in reality, but not really, because a lot of it is prediction. So how can you argue if someone's already made a prediction about you? So for the food, it's interesting. I wrote an article in like 2018, and it was actually about Sorensen Impact. Jim Sorensen in Salt Lake City. Sorensen, also the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is very highly involved among other faith-based institutions. But the technology, both biotech and wearable tech and DNA tech, is very centered in Salt Lake City. And at their business school, they were having a winter symposium about actually Pay for Success Finance, I believe it was in Memphis, with incarcerated youth and the cost of incarcerated youth to society. And that's what the topic was. But at the end, actually, of the Q&A was open, and there was a woman in the audience, and she spoke up, and she said, well, listen, I know you're talking about, offering services to help, kids who end up incarcerated, but I'm here to tell you that if people are hungry, none of the other stuff that you do is going to matter. Because ultimately it all comes, at the baseline, people's most basic need, besides water, is food. And so if you're not addressing food, I don't see where food fits into the conversation. And the gentleman who was, I think it was Ian Galloway, he's with the San Francisco Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve banks are really central in all of this too. And he said, well, the way these deals work is that we need a cost offset. And this was back about 4 or 5 years ago. And he said, we haven't quite figured out what the cost offset, because essentially what they do is they price it out. And probably the most obvious thing is incarceration, because everyone talks about how much it costs a year or a day to incarcerate someone. And then if you stop them from ending up in jail again, you've saved that money, and that's how they justify their deals. We haven't figured out the cost offset for food, but maybe it will be test scores. Maybe we will essentially saying maybe we could set it up that we feed hungry children if we can prove that their test scores go up, and by their test scores going up, that there will be a positive economic outcome.
Okay, and that positive economic outcome means that you have a chart where there's no red, but it's all green. Who gets that green in that in the end of that relationship, when the measurements are all done, the metrics are assessed, Ellison McDowell, where does the green go in that profit or loss picture? The return on investment.
Well, so the challenge with these Pay for Success Finance deals, as they started out, and this is why they've done quite a few pilots, for the past decade, they've been working out the pilot programs, okay? Because they can't what they need to bring them to scale ultimately is digital identity and ubiquitous computing, right? Because to scale it, they can't have someone typing in all of this data. It needs to be really seamless. And so they need to structure deals that are narrow, that can collect massive amounts of individualized data, which is the digital identity systems that are coming now through a variety of mechanisms, whether they're public health-based enforcement of digital identity or digital driver's licenses. These things are coming, and that's what they need to run the deals. So in the beginning, you would have a deal that might last 3 years, and then it closes, and then they tally up if it met the metrics or not. Okay, did you meet the terms of the agreement? And if you met the terms of the agreement, you get paid back your investment plus whatever the agreed upon extra. And that extra is some difference between if all the people who had something bad happen to them and the government had to pay out, that's a pot of money, and then they slice off a bit and say, okay, you can have 10%. If you meet the target, that you fix all these people, you can take this certain percentage for your profit on your investment. And most of these folks don't say they're really in it for a profit, right? Or it's modest, right? It's a community foundation, or one of the big players is the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So they're not looking for gangbuster profit. They're just looking for a modest profit. But what I'm saying is that the thing that needs to come next is that's not enough to run a hedge fund. No hedge fund is going to run on a 3-year deal and sit around and wait for the data. So what they've got is they've gotten ways to work on securitizing them and making them liquid, and that is through blockchain tokenization. And United Way is a central player in this. There's something called ALICE, their ALICE initiative, Assets Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. So ALICE is the working poor. So the United Way will work with the working poor and match them with wraparound services that will ultimately be these deals. But we're not quite there yet because we don't have everyone tagged in the smart environment and with the integrated data interoperability, because they need to know, what did you eat? and then what is the payoff? So for the children, I'm not sure. If I keep
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So for the children, the cost off what might be their improved test score, which will in some future piece have economic productivity.
This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Allison McDowell. Allison, hold on just for a second. We'll be back in just a minute. We've got some wonderful underwriters and sellers on this show, Tulis Report, on what I have dully called commercial government. Of course, commercial government is effectively a revolt against constitutional government limited by the operation of statute and the parties obeying the law, subject to the law, and not operating outside of it. These constraints have long been ignored to the harm of the people, especially the poor, and everybody else. And because we Christian people, we conservatives, have not seen these operations as grave harms and injustice, we are unable to stop what's happening now. And that is, you might say, the second wave of commercial government, and that would be the privatization of government functions on a broad scale in terms of those described by the World Economic Forum and other academicians and thinkers, high and low, good and bad, all thinking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset. These are all buzzwords that seem to have lost their meaning to some extent. But they are describing what's happening here. We are, Allison McDowell, here in Chattanooga, we are a smart city. So I wanted to ask you, what is a smart city as defined by the people who are creating it? Let's say Mayor Tim Kelly here in Chattanooga. And what is the smart city? How do we describe the smart city best in terms of what it really means and where it really is taking the residents and people who live in the city and nearby areas? Allison McDowell.
Well, this is a bit of a deep bit. So I'm just going to say I don't think that the people that are building them actually understand, most of them, what they're building. Because I think people are rewarded to sort of stay in a narrow level of expertise and not really think deeply about it or consider the implications. And I'd mentioned to you before, in terms of just my background is in landscape and geography, and I'm interested in situating like particular locations within their historical context and their local context. And a lot of work that I've been doing lately is actually about the origins of the environmental movement in the United States, in the Atomic Energy Commission, specifically within the context of Oak Ridge National Labs, and using radiation to track energy exchange in ecologies. And it does relate because ultimately the track and trace systems, which are, our individual communications devices, eventually it may be, they talk about nanotechnology or other items that will trace us in our environment. The systems engineers, this is really embedded in cybernetics, which comes from Kubernetes, which is governance, like a machine being governed. And the idea that humans can get enough knowledge that they can control the entire world. I mean, to me, it shows a certain amount of hubris that you can imagine that this amazing creation of the earth and all the things on it, that the nanotechnologists, the biotechnologists, the synthetic biology people, the sensor people, the frequency people, the theoretical physicists can all sort of nail that down and start to run it like a machine. And what they will say is that this has been building since the 70s, limits to growth, and this sort of Malthusian outlook that we all are going to die, and that just leave it to the technicians to run everything. And so if you look at, but what they did to the ecosystems was essentially like unleash radiation so that they could study it. And so I think that the smart cities, we need to understand those within the context of systems engineering. Specifically, there's Ludwig Bertalanffy and Irvin Laszlo, these systems theorists that are international, but also here, also in the MIT and the Bay Area, and Norbert Wiener, and the idea that you could engineer from the tiniest cell to this cosmos that the hubris that the technicians think that they have. And I do think that runs counter to people around the world who have an understanding beyond the material, a faith practice, like a direct connection that we're not in charge of all of the things, right? And so there are these two things held in tension, and increasingly, I feel like the institutions at many levels have yielded the ground without thinking of the ethics of what it means to turn the world into a trackable energy exchange system, of which, interestingly enough, food is a central feature as you imagine it, right? Food is part of this energy exchange. And in fact, the earliest people in the space of ecology working with the Atomic Energy Commission were these Odom brothers, and they were looking at it as metabolic, literally as a metabolism, both within bodies and within ecosystems and within communities. And then I think all of this applies to smart cities. And they want to keep it on, Irvin Laszlo talks about like a homeostat, a world homeostat, which is a cybernetic governance system, a machine governance system, literally like HAL 9000 from, Kubrick's, Space Odyssey, that like, yes, Hal, like Hal gets to be in charge of everything, and Hal gets to run the giant impact investing fund and mete out tokens to let people do things or not, depending on how they're calibrating the system. And I think that's slightly different than some of the like standard discussions about Klaus Schwab is understanding, like actually it's systems engineering, and they needed to do it at a planetary level. And that's why what's unfolded has been happening at the scale it's been happening, because now we are living in a cloud-based world, and increasingly they want to push us into the metaverse. And so as we move through smart cities, whether that's smart pavement, smart streetlights, the smart cities literally can be the iPad in your kid's classroom, right? It can be the digital X-ray in your dentist's office. It can be all of these things are part of a twinning process of representing our life experience, both our internally, our thought processes, our relationships to one another, our relationships to the environment, the built environment, our government, because electronic government is a huge part of this, is to know us in such granular detail linked to these digital identities, and then literally to create digital twins at all scales, from people to cities, and run them like a machine. And this is connected to something called the Japan Moonshot Project, which is like, it's the Japan Science and Technology Agency. So it's like the NSF of Japan. But it's not just Japan, because to live as a cyborg, which is their goal, goal one is that we live outside of mind and body and time and space by 2050. Our Department of Energy is part of that. Lawrence Livermore Lab is part of that. Our National Science Foundation is part of that. I mean, there were people from the Department of Energy at the kickoff, and the timing is interesting, December 2019 in Tokyo. And they're saying that their goal is that we live as a cybernetic representation in a game, really, in a game, but they will use the material world to get enough data to mirror it into a metaverse world. And Nippon Telegraph and Telephone is a very important telecommunications. They have a white paper on human digital twins from March 2021. And even they say, well, we know how to sync all of your data in a given day to your digital twin to keep it up to date. But we do have some concerns when the life that the digital twin is living wherever it's living wants to sync back to the person. And so what my plea to people in this space is that these technologies came out of DARPA. These technologies are military technologies, and they're integrated with the highest level military behavioral psychology programming and game theory. And the most sophisticated levels of, like, these folks are working with Hollywood and the University of Southern California's, Institute for Creative Technologies and the Army Research Lab. They're all, like, literally they could try to craft a game and put us in it, and we would lose all agency. And to me, like, that is the biggest separation from, like, faith, God, anything.
Well, is that possible, Allison, that this twinning project, again, showing their computing prowess and their cache, I guess, CACHE, their ability to store huge amounts of data that move, pieces that move, can they really do that? And where is the profit to any of these players? Where does the new money come from? Where is the gain for these people? How are they profiting themselves or enriching themselves in doing this? And what might the effect be on the common citizen drinking a coffee downtown next to one of the street lamps that needs to have its horizontal bar added? Where are we being affected, and how?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say one, like, do we want, even if it doesn't all come together in my, I'm in my 50s, my lifetime, do we want to live the world of living in, literally, this is the CIA's video game. I mean, Niantic augmented reality, Augmented Cities is run like with Niantic and the Knight Foundation. They're here in Philly. That is backed, that Niantic's primary funder is InQtel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA, right? So like I've asked people, who worked with the CIA and came out of Wharton, like, do we want to live in the CIA's video game? Like maybe, and then maybe some people do because they think the CIA will keep them safe in the video game. I don't think that's why we were put here, was to live in somebody else's game. So that's the question for me. And then the other piece is you talk about money, but what I really want to emphasize, and right now there's a lot of conversation around cryptocurrencies and blockchain. There's increasingly critiques of it, but people are not understanding that money moving forward isn't going to be what we think it is today or what we've traditionally understood. It will be access. It will be rights and privileges. It will be literally tokens that allow you to do things or not do things, which is kind of abstracted from what we have today, right? Like if you have more tokens, you can do things like go to the Bahamas. And if you don't have the tokens, you can't. But it will be even more directly engineered and linked to the twinning. And so and a lot of people talk about that as carbon credits or Chinese social credit scoring. I'm saying it's different. What these people are after, the systems theorists, the cyberneticians who came out of World War II, they actually, and this is Julian Huxley, UNESCO, the UN, they imagine that there is a new level of evolution. This is eugenics. But this is not genocide eugenics. This is simply, they imagine that we will be enhanced to a level that we will exist outside of our limited material body. And so they are using these tokens and the twinning and the energy with the quantum computers to attempt to catalyze new forms of life based on information, which I know sounds crazy, but once you look into the complexity theory and the theoretical physics, and, I was doing some reading. There's an essay by this gentleman, J.D. Bernal, who is the leading X-ray crystallographer at Cambridge in 1929. And he wrote a book called The Word, the Flesh, and the Devil, an inquiry into the future of the three enemies of the rational soul. Now, this gentleman, like I said, he was the pioneer in X-ray crystallography. He was the lead science advisor to Mountbatten in World War II on D-Day. This was a smart guy who was very well connected. And in his book, he literally, in 1929, is speaking of a future where we live is a larval stage for 100 years, and then we put our brain in a cylinder and we live through haptic, like crustacean-like haptic robotics and like chemosensory organs for like forever. It's this radical life extension. And I'm not even saying it will all happen, but we have to know where it came from. This guy wasn't a crank. They actually think that they're going to create some other more evolved life form out of all of this information. And yeah, they're going to make a lot of money along the way. Like certain people, very small numbers of people will make money on the deals and on the securitized debt and on selling the cloud computing and on making the devices. And, I do this because I would like for there to be a chance that somebody's kids don't have to run the open air prison. Like that somebody can, be a craftsman or write a play or do something else other than to build the metaverse and defend it. That's what I'm fighting for. And I don't know how much of this sociopathy will come to pass, but I feel like we have to talk about it. And we have to understand it beyond money and control, which it is, but it's actually about catalyzing new forms of existence using information.
This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Allison McDowell. She is a blogger, and she has truly an amazing work at wrenchinthegears.com. That's wrenchinthegears.com, and we're talking about the idea of a smart city and the future of it, the people who have envisioned smart cities and what they have in their religious zeal in view, how they want man to be improved, how they want effectively to replace God himself, and to run a kind of managerial top-down surveillance society. And Allison, we've got some sponsor messages I want to hear and our listener to hear as well, so that we can encourage these connections among local economy players.
Tennessee, David Tulis.
David Tulis, we're talking with a remarkable writer named Allison McDowell, and she's tracing the origins of the smart city concept from Oak Ridge, from those students and experts in energy and data, And she got her start in Philly writing about education.
At Guild, our mission is to unlock economic opportunity for America's workforce through education and upskilling. We see education, upskilling, and reskilling as a fundamental part of this larger effort to ensure that all Americans have a place in the economy of the future. There are 88 million and growing Americans who today risk severe economic irrelevance and unemployment if we don't upskill and reskill them for the future of work. So what we do is we partner with forward-thinking companies, including many of America's largest employers, to offer education and upskilling to their employees, debt-free, and connect them with the nation's best nonprofit and public universities and innovative learning providers, along with coaching at every step of the way. One of the values that's most important to us is aligning our business model and creating a true double bottom line, doing for us what's right for students and our state.
This is David Tulis, and we're hearing a woman named Rachel Carlson at Guild Education, and we're part of this this new world order, the new economic order that Allison McDowell writes about. She is a blogger in Philadelphia. She runs a website called Wrench in the Gears, and what I appreciate about you, Allison, is your very succinct and sort of packed nomenclature describing the ideals of the sustainable, resilient, stakeholder, equity, trust economy, with its inclusive opportunities and community, innovative, data-driven impact orientation, brought about, of course, by leadership to help the workforce, right? Those are all the key words in the buzzwords in what we're talking about. So you got your start in writing about this whole phenomenon of the smart city movement and other things that connect with it, Allison, in education. So what is this woman saying? What does she mean, upskilling, reskilling? Why do we look down on that? Why does that look like a bad thing? Why is there some harm perceived in these words, Allison?
Well, so the thing that I keep trying to emphasize to folks is that we need to get familiar with the next level of globalization in the global economic structure that has been planned. And it's called Globalization 4.0. And there's an economist who I think is U.S., but he's based in Geneva. A lot of these blockchain programs are based in Switzerland. His name is Richard Baldwin. And he talks about Globalization 4.0. I have a YouTube channel, and you can listen to a clip there. But essentially he says that what is coming next is the digitization of the service sector, of the knowledge sector and the service sector. And we've already seen that with people who do, the last 2.5 years of lockdowns have been all about the remote work, right? But even prior to that, in the education space, I knew people who were public school teachers who weren't making enough to make ends meet, and they would get up in the middle of the night and go online for VIP Kid and tutor in China, right? So it's this, initially we know what outsourced offshore service labor looks like in terms of, tech or call centers or all these things. But it's about to get even more complicated because what they're developing is something called remote haptic labor. And also we've even seen within the meta, the metaverse is far more than Mark Zuckerberg's meta. It's literally that we would have collective meeting places as avatars in the metaverse, in this space that is the what I call the CIA's video game. But even within haptic robotics, they want you to put your brain in a robot, literally, to put on a VR headset, hold the haptic controllers in your hand, and you could operate this. And there's a woman, her name is Suzanne Gildert. She's based out of Vancouver. She runs a company called Sanctuary AI. She was formerly with D-Wave Quantum Computing. And she literally has talks where she says, well, the future is that there will be a robot outside the shop, and it will wave to you and say, we have a special on jeans. Don't you want to come in? And then when you talk to the robot, eventually it will get too hard for the robot to do. So a pilot, they call it a pilot, a real person, who's some remote person, will jump in to the robot and carry on the conversation. And you might not even know when it goes from AI to a person. Or maybe you do know a person. And then the question is, how do you know? Does it show up a little picture on the badge of the person? Are you talking to, a 60-year-old man or a 18-year-old girl, or who are you talking to, right? You're talking to a robot. You're talking to someone on the other end. And even with other remote, they're doing delivery robots, right? That's one of the things they're talking about. There's another company, they were talking about competing on online platforms to do
remote robotic work, and they were excited at the prospect that one person could run 10 robots in 10 different Walmarts. Like, that's the future that they're imagining, the future of work, is that it's people doing incredibly degrading and dehumanized things for data extraction, because all of this money is going for data extraction. Those people will be put on leaderboards and ranked, and some of them will be in training, right? So she's talking about, like, workforce development. But she's not saying this is not the world where you go and you work for Procter & Gamble for 30 years. No, this is like you have micro work contracts that may last a week, and then you've got to do the next micro work contract. And the AI is sorting and rating you based on your badges and credentials, which is what they're training the kids to do with the competency-based education. But they've always framed it as lifelong learning. You're lifelong learning on the ledger so the AI can learn you, sort you, control your whole life. And they're controlling the life. This is the challenge, like within like a nationalist framing, is they're going to do this to everyone in the world. Like the kids in Chattanooga are going to be pitted against the kids in India, the kids in the Philippines, the kids in Kenya, the kids in Poland. Everyone is going to race to the bottom. There will be no protection. There will be none. And we're doing it. Like, they're not doing it to us. We're literally, like, the U.S. is a leader in the space of setting this all up. And I just say, like, ethically, are we doing this? Is this a legacy that we're leaving the next generations? Are we going to be good ancestors if we allow this to happen in the world? Because this isn't fulfilling. They want to tell you a fancy story about how, like, your employer is going to continue to develop you. That's a lie. All you have to do is look up Richard Baldwin, Globalization 4.0, and he will tell you. And look up Sanctuary II, and look up, I'm trying to remember the other, it's another Canadian company. But you have to compete to even try to run the remote robot to deliver your UPS package. And that's the world we're building for kids, and it's unacceptable.
So
like, and the problem is we're all building it. Like your nice neighbor. Like, it's not Klaus Schwab that's the problem. It's like your nice neighbor and your niece and your aunt, and like everyone's doing it. They're building it, and because we built an economy on that.
So, Allison McDowell, as public schools fail and as people are looking past them toward homeschooling and private arrangements for educational benefits and blessings for children, you have these other people coming in to say, well, we can help you make your child employable, a worker. And their view of education is not in the classical Christian sense where you are ennobled, given means for your private and personal genius to expand, to become useful in society as a whole. Their view is that you have to become part of this sort of digital machine to become a worker, able to move swiftly as the market changes, right? As you were saying with short-term contracts online.
Exactly. And then before all of these lockdowns happened, I was reading things. KnowledgeWorks is one of the key players in developing, they call it learning ecosystems. And it's lifelong learning. You don't get to just learn until you're 18 or you're 21 or you're 25 with some advanced degree. No, they're literally going to reskill you until you die. Because it's about getting the data. It's about Google and the giant, massive blockchain brain getting your data. And a lot of it is also social emotional. They want behavioral data. They want to know how you feel, how you act, what your values are. That all needs to become codable to the machine too. And they want all kinds, right? So the polarity thing is also a distraction, because I think if people on either end of the ideological spectrum understood, we would unite and say this is an abomination. But we're meant to kept busy in sort of certain boxes so we don't actually see the bigger plan. But yeah, they want people to homeschool. Like, the plan that I saw was that they were planning to take schools apart, because in a data economy, if you understand learners, whether those are preschool toddlers on a surveillance play table, or that's a middle schooler getting some sort of anti-bullying curriculum, or this is like a 6-year-old person getting retrained to code the metaverse, all of those are potential data sets you can run around and watch. And the AI wants to sit on your shoulder and watch you and build a twin of you and build a cognitive model and put it on the shelf. So eventually the idea is that if they get enough billions of cognitive models, maybe, Pinocchio could become a real boy. I mean, that's how they think of it, right? Because they think of existence in a technical term, not something that comes from beyond, from a religious force, creative force, something like that. They think they could build it. So yeah, they want to run everybody around. They would love homeschool, because most homeschool people, honestly, these days, they're logging onto a computer program. Like, they're not literally pulling out books and paper. that's rare.
Well, let me ask you. You mentioned
the traditional unschooling communities, libraries, community theater, art spaces, sports. Those are all going to be put on blockchain for these badges because the government's going to give you a blockchain voucher for choice. And as soon as any of those places that you used to go for your non-traditional education take the money, the data will be attached. So this is a giant grab for data, essentially to inside out homeschooling, to turn it all into a panopticon.
Alison McDowell, you are the writer at wrenchinthegears.com, and I do recommend that you read her. Her site is called wrenchinthegears.com. And we mentioned two things that are physical. You mentioned the physical world of books and paper. My wife, Jeanette, and I live in a house full of books. It's called the Green Door Private Lending Library. Of all the classics, Jeanette knows the good books, and we have culled and bought books for years to secure the best literature for children. And that's physical point number one. The physical point number two is Mayor Tim Kelly here in Chattanooga. He pulls his pants up every morning, buckles his belt, combs his hair, gets in his car, and goes to the city in his office on East 11th Street and runs the city government. Okay, so we have the physical world and limits. We have personal limits. And I wanted to ask you about in what terms do you propose we resist this digitization? Here we have, again, the physical world and common people, ordinary people. We have wealthy executives who run businesses who don't even know how to use their phone except to make phone calls, don't text. I mean, we have a lot of simple people who are not going to be very well received in this world, and they won't go there. And I would think probably most people won't want to go there once they realize what's happening. So how do we resist this major trend, Alison McDowell?
Well, I think we have to actually understand the nature of the problem and take some responsibility for how, understand where it came from, right? I think there's a lot of narrative in the space now that somehow this just recently happened. And in my frame, and again, it's not necessarily everybody's, but that I believe that the Indian reservations were the model for the smart cities. And, I gave a talk to conservative libertarians in Tucson, Arizona, which is a center of a lot of defense contracting and research work into consciousness and all sorts of things that they want to play around in. And I said, listen, this is the site of the Apache Wars. It's the largest U.S. military engagement in our 30 years that went on, the Apache Wars. And I said, they were after those folks. They wanted to take apart their families. They wanted to make their religion illegal. They wanted their resources. They want to assimilate, right? That's where we're at now, is that even people who are coming from maybe a conservative Christian standpoint, we need to actually kind of reflect on what that was, because the logic of the machine system is that now the net is widened to include everything. And so, there's some lessons to be learned in that space. And I think to know where it came from, to know this didn't just show up 2 years ago, to take responsibility for the militarism, to the fact that we built an economy on debt and war, a lot of it, and to come to terms with some of that and then figure it out. There's no easy way to unwind this. I mean, for me, I feel actually a lot of it goes back to the Roman Empire. It's empire. It's domination principle. And so, and even within faith communities, I'm sure, because there's nothing's homogenous, there might be some communities that feel like it's fine to dominate other people with certain principles because they know best. And I guess that's what I'm asking people to kind of come to terms with, is knowing the tools that are going to be showing up at the door. Really be thoughtful about your values and know, would you use this tool to dominate someone in the idea that you know best for them, or do we leave the door open?
Alison, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm really honored to have you on and appreciate the time you've given to me and to you.